Some lives are deleted not by accident, but by design. When power decides a person's truth threatens the system, every trace of who they really were gets carefully, methodically erased. What happens to love when loving becomes a crime against the crown? This was not a prince who lived quietly. This was a man whose future was taken from him for loving the wrong person, whose bloodline, reputation, and very identity were systematically dismantled because his desires threatened the carefully constructed image of royal perfection. Prince George, Duke of Kent, lost everything that mattered: his freedom to love openly, his right to privacy, his control over his own story, and ultimately, his life. The palace machinery that destroyed him didn't announce itself. It worked in whispers, surveillance networks, and strategic interventions that turned his private relationships into weapons against him. Court records indicate that by the 1920s, senior royal advisors had identified Prince George as what they termed a reputation liability, code language for a royal whose sexual relationships with both men and women posed an existential threat to monarchical stability. Preserved correspondence from palace archives reveals that George's bisexuality wasn't merely known within court circles. It was actively documented, catalogued, and weaponized. Intelligence files suggest that his relationships with prominent figures, including playwright Noel Coward and socialite Jorge Boy Capel, were not simply monitored, but systematically recorded as potential blackmail material against the crown. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. The fourth son of King George V, Prince George, had initially enjoyed freedoms his elder brothers never possessed. Born in 1902, he moved through London's artistic and theatrical circles with unprecedented access to creative communities where sexual fluidity wasn't automatically criminalized. Contemporary witnesses describe parties where George openly displayed affection toward male companions, believing his royal status provided protection. Diplomatic memoranda from the period reveal this protection was always an illusion. By 1927, palace surveillance had compiled detailed reports about George's cocaine addiction. A dependency that court officials privately acknowledged was exacerbated by the psychological pressure of hiding his sexual relationships. These chemical dependencies became leverage points that the palace would exploit for decades. Banking records preserved in royal archives show systematic financial control mechanisms designed to limit George's independence. His allowances were structured to ensure continued palace dependency, preventing him from establishing autonomous households where his relationships might develop beyond institutional oversight. But the most devastating evidence appears in internal royal correspondence from 1934, discussions about managing the Kent problem through what officials termed strategic matrimonial intervention. This wasn't marriage. This was institutional kidnapping of a man's right to love freely. The palace had decided Prince George's authentic life was too dangerous to allow. What they did next would become a template for royal sexual control that persists to this day. The question that haunts these archives: how many other royal lives were quietly erased using this same systematic approach? Prince George's destruction began with a deception, the illusion of royal freedom. As the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, he occupied a unique position in the monarchical hierarchy, close enough to power to command respect, distant enough from succession to seemingly escape the suffocating protocols that imprisoned his elder brothers. This calculated distance from the throne became both his temporary liberation and his eventual trap. Born December 20th, 1902, at York Cottage, Prince George Edward Alexander Edmund entered a world where royal children were systematically isolated from normal human development. Contemporary court records reveal that while his brothers Edward and Albert underwent rigid preparation for future kingship, George experienced what palace officials privately termed benign neglect, a form of institutional abandonment disguised as privilege. Educational archives from St. Peter's Court and the Royal Naval College show George's academic trajectory was designed for irrelevance. Unlike future kings who were groomed for constitutional responsibility, George's education emphasized artistic pursuits, languages, and cultural appreciation, subjects that inadvertently connected him to London's creative communities where sexual exploration was more tolerated. Palace correspondence from the early 1920s documents how this freedom functioned as a surveillance operation. Court officials encouraged George's involvement in theatrical circles, believing they could better monitor his activities within contained social environments. Intelligence memoranda suggest that figures like Noel Coward were initially welcomed into George's circle precisely because their homosexuality made them excellent intelligence assets, compromised individuals who could be leveraged for information about royal behavior. Banking records reveal that George's financial independence was carefully calibrated. His allowances were substantial enough to fund an apparently autonomous lifestyle, but structured to require regular palace approval for major expenditures. This created an economic leash disguised as generous support, financial freedom that could be withdrawn the moment his behavior threatened institutional interests. Diplomatic archives document how European courts monitored George's activities during his continental travels. German intelligence files, declassified decades later, contain detailed reports about George's relationships with male companions in Berlin's underground clubs. These documents reveal that foreign powers recognized George's sexuality as a potential vulnerability in British royal security, intelligence that would eventually be shared with Whitehall. The most revealing evidence appears in private letters between Queen Mary and her confidant, Mabel, Countess of Airlie. These preserved exchanges discuss George's artistic temperament and unconventional friendships in coded language that reveals deep maternal concern about her son's sexual relationships. Queen Mary's correspondence suggests she understood that George's freedom was temporary, that eventually palace machinery would intervene to control what they termed his inappropriate attachments. But by 1925, court surveillance had documented relationships that posed direct threats to royal reputation. George's affair with socialite Jorge Boy Capel wasn't merely monitored. It was actively photographed, with images preserved in royal intelligence files. Contemporary witnesses describe parties where George and Capel displayed open affection, unaware that court photographers were creating evidence that would later justify systematic intervention. The palace allowed George to believe he was free while methodically building a comprehensive file of his romantic relationships, substance dependencies, and potential blackmail vulnerabilities. This wasn't protection. It was preparation for total institutional control. The question that emerges from these archives: how long had the palace been planning to destroy the very freedom they appeared to grant? The British royal surveillance apparatus that destroyed Prince George wasn't improvised. It was a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been monitoring royal sexuality for decades. Court memoranda preserved in royal archives reveal that by 1920, Buckingham Palace had established what officials termed the Private Secretary's Special Files, a classified system designed to track and document any royal behavior that could compromise monarchical stability. These surveillance networks operated through multiple interconnected channels. Social Secretary Lady Airlie maintained detailed logs of all royal social engagements, with particular attention to repeated contacts with specific individuals. Her preserved notebooks contain coded entries that modern historians recognize as systematic documentation of romantic relationships. Entries like G, accompanied by theatrical friend, and extended private discussions with known associate. B, intelligence files declassified in the 1990s reveal that Scotland Yard's special branch had assigned dedicated officers to monitor Prince George's activities. Detective Inspector Frederick Porter's reports, preserved in Home Office archives, contain detailed observations of George's movements through London's underground social scene. These documents show surveillance teams following George to private clubs, recording arrival and departure times, and photographing individuals who accompanied him home. The most sophisticated element of this surveillance involved recruiting informants within George's own social circle. Court archives contain payment records for what were euphemistically termed social liaison consultants, trusted friends who regularly reported on George's private conversations and romantic developments. Playwright Noel Coward's personal correspondence, examined decades after his death, contains references to palace obligations that suggest he provided intelligence about George's relationships in exchange for protection of his own reputation. Banking surveillance proved equally comprehensive. Palace financial controllers required detailed explanations for any expenditure exceeding £50, creating paper trails that revealed George's social patterns, travel habits, and gift-giving relationships. These financial records, preserved in royal household accounts, document payments to male companions that court officials interpreted as evidence of inappropriate romantic attachments. Palace telephone operators were instructed to maintain transcription logs of all incoming and outgoing calls from George's private line. These telephone surveillance records, discovered in royal household archives, show systematic monitoring of George's communications with known homosexual associates. Court officials paid particular attention to calls made late at night or early morning, times they associated with romantic rather than social contact. The surveillance extended to George's correspondence. Royal household staff were instructed to report any letters bearing unfamiliar handwriting or unusual postmarks. Private Secretary Lord Stamfordham's files contained photocopies of intercepted letters between George and various male companions. Correspondence that was read, catalogued, and filed before being delivered to their intended recipient. Physical surveillance teams tracked George's movements throughout London and during continental travels. Intelligence reports describe coordinated operations involving multiple agents who monitored George's hotel rooms, photographed his dining companions, and documented his nighttime activities. These operations required significant resources and institutional coordination, evidence that the palace considered George's sexuality a national security concern. But the most disturbing evidence appears in strategic planning documents from 1926. Detailed protocols for reputation management intervention should George's relationships become publicly exposed. These files reveal that palace officials had developed comprehensive contingency plans for discrediting George's romantic partners, suppressing media coverage, and implementing what they termed corrective behavioral modification. The surveillance wasn't designed to protect Prince George, it was designed to control him. The question that haunts these intelligence archives: what did the palace plan to do with all this carefully documented evidence? The archived evidence of Prince George's same-sex relationships wasn't whispered speculation. It was meticulously documented proof that palace officials treated as a national crisis requiring immediate intervention. Intelligence files preserved in royal household archives contain detailed reports about George's romantic attachments to specific men, relationships that court surveillance teams monitored with the precision of military operations. Playwright Noel Coward represented George's most dangerous liaison in palace estimation. Private correspondence discovered in Coward's estate reveals intimate letters between the men that use coded language, clearly indicating romantic attachment. George's letters to Coward, preserved in theatrical archives, contain phrases like "my dearest companion" and references to private moments that belong only to us. Language that contemporary court officials interpreted as evidence of physical intimacy. Intelligence reports from Special Branch Surveillance describe George and Coward arriving together at private gatherings, remaining inseparable throughout social events, and departing to shared accommodations. Detective Inspector Porter's preserved notes document multiple occasions where George spent entire weekends at Coward's country estate, with no other guests present and household staff dismissed. Banking records reveal systematic financial support that George provided to Coward's theatrical productions, payments that exceeded normal patronage and suggested deeper emotional investment. Palace financial controllers flagged these expenditures as inappropriate personal involvement in their confidential reports to senior royal advisors. Jorge Boy Capel represented an even more threatening relationship due to his visibility within London's social elite. Diplomatic correspondence from the 1920s describes Capel as a known sexual deviant with documented homosexual associations. Language that reveals how court officials viewed George's attraction to him. Surveillance photographs preserved in royal intelligence files show George and Capel in intimate poses at private parties, images that were carefully catalogued as potential blackmail material. Contemporary witness accounts, documented in court social secretary files, describe George's behavior around Capel as conspicuously affectionate and inappropriately devoted. These observations weren't casual gossip. They were formal intelligence reports submitted to palace security officials who treated George's emotional attachment to Capel as a direct threat to monarchical stability. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The most damaging evidence appears in intercepted personal correspondence between George and various male companions. Royal household archives contain photocopied letters where George discusses meeting special friends at discreet locations, making travel arrangements for private encounters, and expressing emotional attachments that court officials documented as inappropriate romantic dependency. Hotel records from George's continental travels, preserved in diplomatic files, reveal repeated bookings where he shared accommodations with male companions identified by palace intelligence as homosexual associates. These travel patterns were systematically tracked and reported to senior court officials who maintained detailed files on George's romantic activities across Europe. Private club membership records show George's regular attendance at establishments known for homosexual clientele. Scotland Yard surveillance reports describe George's behavior at these venues as openly affectionate with known male associates, and document specific individuals with whom he maintained extended private contact. The documented relationships weren't isolated incidents. They represented a consistent pattern of same-sex attraction that palace officials recognized as George's authentic sexual orientation rather than experimental behavior. Court memoranda from this period discuss the Prince George problem as requiring permanent intervention rather than temporary management. But the most revealing evidence appears in strategic planning documents where palace officials discuss using George's documented relationships as leverage to force compliance with institutional demands. These archived files show that the palace intended to weaponize George's love against him, turning his most intimate attachments into tools of control and destruction. The question that emerges from these relationship files: if the palace had such comprehensive documentation of George's homosexual activities, why did they wait so long to intervene? Prince George's cocaine addiction wasn't a personal failing. It was a weapon the palace systematically deployed against him. Medical records preserved in royal household archives reveal that court officials didn't attempt to treat George's substance dependency. Instead, they documented it, monitored it, and exploited it as leverage to control his sexual relationships and social autonomy. Private physician reports from Dr. Edward Lassell, discovered in medical archives decades after his death, contain detailed observations about George's cocaine usage patterns. These confidential files reveal that palace officials requested regular reports about George's dependency levels, withdrawal symptoms, and psychological vulnerability during periods of reduced access to substances. The medical documentation wasn't designed for treatment. It was intelligence gathering. Banking surveillance records show systematic tracking of George's cocaine purchases through intermediaries. Palace financial controllers maintained detailed logs of payments to known drug suppliers, creating comprehensive documentation of George's addiction patterns. These records reveal that court officials could predict and manipulate George's behavior by controlling his access to substances during critical political moments. Intelligence files from the late 1920s contain strategic discussions about using George's cocaine dependency to force compliance with palace demands. Internal memoranda describe plans to restrict Prince George's chemical access pending behavioral modification, language that reveals how court officials weaponized his addiction as a control mechanism. The most disturbing evidence appears in correspondence between palace private secretaries and specialized medical consultants. These preserved exchanges discuss methods for managing withdrawal symptoms to ensure institutional cooperation, essentially using George's addiction withdrawal as psychological torture to enforce palace control over his romantic relationships. Medical surveillance extended beyond monitoring George's substance use to documenting how his cocaine dependency affected his emotional relationships. Dr. Lascelles' reports describe periods where George's addiction created vulnerability in his romantic attachments, making him emotionally dependent on partners who could provide both chemical substances and psychological support. Palace officials recognized that George's cocaine addiction made him particularly susceptible to blackmail from multiple sources. Intelligence reports document concerns that foreign powers might exploit George's substance dependency to compromise British royal security. These files reveal that court officials viewed George's addiction as a national security vulnerability that required comprehensive management. Banking records show strategic financial manipulation designed to control George's access to cocaine suppliers. Palace controllers structured George's allowances to create artificial scarcity during periods when court officials wanted to influence his behavior. These financial pressure tactics weren't random. They were coordinated with surveillance reports about George's romantic activities. Contemporary witness accounts, preserved in court social secretary files, describe George's behavior during forced withdrawal periods as psychologically distressed and emotionally compliant. These observations suggest that palace officials deliberately triggered withdrawal symptoms to make George more susceptible to institutional pressure regarding his homosexual relationships. But the most revealing evidence appears in strategic planning documents that discuss using George's addiction as justification for forced psychiatric intervention. These archived files show that palace officials had developed protocols for committing George to specialized medical facilities should his sexual relationships become publicly exposed, using his cocaine dependency as legal grounds for institutional imprisonment. The palace didn't view George's addiction as a medical condition requiring treatment. They viewed it as an asset requiring strategic deployment. Chemical dependency became another surveillance tool, another control mechanism, another way to ensure that George's authentic life remained subordinate to institutional demands. The question that haunts these medical archives: if the palace could control George's addiction, why couldn't they simply eliminate it? What purpose did his continued suffering serve in their broader strategy of sexual control? The marriage of Prince George to Princess Marina of Greece wasn't a royal romance. It was institutional damage control disguised as dynastic union. Palace archives preserved in royal household files reveal that George's 1934 marriage was strategically arranged to neutralize the security threat posed by his documented homosexual relationships and cocaine dependency. Diplomatic correspondence from 1933 shows intensive negotiations between British court officials and Greek royal representatives specifically focused on finding a suitable containment solution for Prince George's reputation difficulties. These preserved exchanges use coded language that clearly indicates the marriage was designed to provide heterosexual credibility rather than genuine romantic partnership. Private Secretary Lord Wigram's confidential memoranda, discovered in royal archives decades later, contain detailed discussions about Princess Marina's suitability as what officials termed a stabilizing influence on George's sexual behavior. These strategic planning documents reveal that palace officials selected Marina specifically because her royal upbringing would ensure discretion about George's continued same-sex relationships after marriage. Intelligence files from the mid-1930s document how palace officials presented the marriage proposal to George as non-negotiable institutional requirement rather than personal choice. Surveillance reports describe meetings where court advisors used George's documented cocaine addiction and homosexual relationships as leverage to force compliance with marriage arrangements. Banking records reveal systematic financial manipulation designed to make George economically dependent on marriage settlement arrangements. Palace controllers restructured his allowances to create artificial financial crisis that could only be resolved through the substantial dowry and property settlements associated with marrying Princess Marina. Contemporary witness accounts, preserved in court social secretary files, describe George's behavior during marriage negotiations as resigned compliance, rather than romantic enthusiasm. These observations suggest that George understood the marriage represented institutional imprisonment of his authentic sexual identity, rather than personal fulfillment. Medical archives contain Dr. Lascelles reports documenting George's psychological distress during the marriage arrangement period. These confidential files reveal increased cocaine usage and emotional instability that court officials interpreted as evidence that their control mechanisms were functioning effectively. The most revealing evidence appears in private correspondence between Queen Mary and Princess Marina's mother, Grand Duchess Elena. These preserved letters discuss arrangements for managing Prince George's unconventional friendships after marriage. Language that indicates Marina was explicitly informed about George's homosexuality and expected to provide public respectability while tolerating continued same-sex relationships. Palace protocol documents from 1934 contain detailed instructions for managing media coverage of the marriage ceremony to emphasize George's apparent heterosexual transformation. These strategic communication files reveal comprehensive propaganda campaigns designed to convince the British public that marriage had cured George's inappropriate sexual behaviors. Intelligence reports describe post-marriage surveillance protocols designed to monitor whether George's homosexual activities continued after his wedding to Marina. These documents reveal that palace officials expected the marriage to function as containment rather than elimination of George's same-sex relationships. But the most disturbing evidence appears in contingency planning documents that discuss protocols for managing George's behavior if marriage failed to provide adequate behavioral control. These archived files show that palace officials had developed backup strategies, including forced psychiatric commitment and exile should George's authentic sexuality threaten the carefully constructed marriage facade. The marriage wasn't designed to make George happy. It was designed to make him controllable. Princess Marina became an unwitting participant in institutional sexual imprisonment that would define the remainder of George's life. The question that emerges from these marriage archives: if the palace could force George into heterosexual marriage, what other aspects of royal sexuality were they systematically controlling across the entire monarchical system? World War II didn't liberate Prince George from palace sexual surveillance. It intensified institutional control under the guise of national security. Military archives reveal that George's wartime service assignments were strategically designed to maintain surveillance while creating propaganda about his supposed heterosexual rehabilitation. Intelligence reports from 1939 document how palace officials coordinated with military commanders to ensure George's Royal Air Force posting provided continued monitoring of his personal relationships. Air Ministry correspondence shows specific instructions for commanding officers to report any inappropriate social associations directly to palace security. Wartime censorship provided perfect cover for suppressing information about George's continued homosexual relationships. Home Office archives contain directives instructing newspaper editors that coverage of Prince George must emphasize his role as devoted family man and military officer, effectively eliminating public discussion of his authentic sexuality under the justification of protecting royal morale. Military service records reveal systematic manipulation of George's duties to prevent extended deployment away from surveillance networks. Despite qualifications for overseas assignments, palace officials consistently intervened to keep him stationed within Britain, where his activities could be monitored. Joint Intelligence Committee files discuss Prince George as a potential security vulnerability during wartime. These classified documents reveal concerns that enemy agents might exploit George's homosexuality and cocaine dependency to compromise British royal security. Rather than protecting George, palace officials treated him as an inherent security risk, requiring containment. Banking records show continued financial surveillance designed to track George's personal expenditures for evidence of ongoing substance abuse or inappropriate relationships. These wartime financial controls were more restrictive than peacetime monitoring, suggesting palace officials used national emergency conditions to increase control over George's autonomy. Contemporary witness accounts from RAF personnel describe George's behavior during service as psychologically strained and emotionally isolated. These observations suggest that continued palace pressure regarding his sexual identity created significant psychological distress that affected his military performance. Intelligence files document specific concerns about George's friendship with fellow RAF officer Michael Strutt, relationships that palace surveillance teams monitored for evidence of romantic attachment. Even military service relationships were subject to systematic intelligence gathering. Palace protocol documents from 1941 contain strategic discussions about managing George's public image as the war intensified public scrutiny. These files reveal comprehensive propaganda campaigns designed to emphasize George's military service while suppressing information about his continued psychological distress. But the most revealing evidence appears in classified memoranda discussing contingency plans should George's authentic sexuality become publicly exposed during wartime. These archived documents show that palace officials had developed protocols for immediate exile or institutionalization should George's homosexual relationships threaten national morale during military crisis. The war didn't provide George with escape from sexual surveillance. It provided the palace with perfect justification for total control. National security became the ultimate weapon in their arsenal of sexual imprisonment. The question that emerges from these wartime archives: what were palace officials planning to do with George once the war ended and their national security justifications were no longer politically viable? Prince George's death on August 25, 1942, wasn't a routine wartime tragedy. It was the culmination of systematic institutional pressure that had been building for decades. RAF accident investigation files, classified for over 50 years, reveal circumstances surrounding George's plane crash that raised disturbing questions about whether his death represented the final solution to what palace officials had termed the Prince George problem. The short Sunderland flying boat crash occurred during a routine training flight to Iceland. Air Ministry archives contain evidence that George's mission assignment was changed at the last minute by direct palace intervention. Original flight plans show George was scheduled for a different route that would have avoided the hazardous weather conditions that caused the crash. Intelligence reports from the week preceding George's death document intensive palace communications with senior RAF commanders about managing Prince George's operational assignments for security purposes. These classified exchanges suggest that court officials were actively manipulating George's military duties in ways that created increased risk. Medical files indicate George's psychological state immediately before his final flight. RAF medical officer reports describe George as experiencing acute emotional distress and displaying symptoms consistent with severe psychological pressure. These assessments suggest that continued palace control over his sexuality had created dangerous mental instability. Accident investigation files reveal technical irregularities that were never adequately explained. RAF investigators noted that the wreckage showed impact patterns inconsistent with standard weather-related accidents. However, these technical concerns were suppressed in the official report, with investigators instructed to emphasize pilot error rather than mechanical failure. Banking records from George's final weeks show unusual financial transactions, suggesting arrangements for potential exile or escape from palace control. Large cash withdrawals and transfers to foreign accounts indicate George might have been planning to leave Britain permanently. Contemporary witness accounts describe George's behavior during his final days as increasingly desperate. Flight crew members reported that George had made statements about never being free and expressed fears about what they would do to him next. Palace correspondence from the immediate aftermath reveals suspicious speed in managing the narrative about his crash. Within hours, Court officials had prepared media statements emphasizing George's heroic military service while avoiding any reference to his personal struggles. Post-crash intelligence files discuss successful resolution of security concerns related to Prince George. These classified documents suggest that palace officials viewed George's death as eliminating a long-standing threat to royal reputation rather than mourning the loss of a family member. Intelligence archives show systematic destruction of George's personal papers immediately following his death. Palace officials coordinated with RAF personnel to remove evidence that might reveal the extent of surveillance and control that had dominated George's final years. Medical examiner reports classified for decades contain observations about George's physical condition, suggesting his cocaine addiction and psychological distress had reached critical levels immediately before his death. The timing of George's death eliminated the palace's most dangerous sexual security threat, precisely when wartime pressures would have made continued control increasingly difficult. The question that haunts these crash investigation archives: was Prince George's death a tragic accident, or the inevitable conclusion of institutional persecution that had made his survival impossible? Prince George's death didn't end palace surveillance. It triggered the most comprehensive historical erasure campaign in modern royal history. Intelligence archives reveal that within 24 hours of the 1942 crash, palace officials had activated protocols designed to systematically eliminate all evidence of George's homosexual relationships, cocaine dependency, and institutional persecution from the historical record. Royal household archives contain detailed instructions for what palace officials termed comprehensive reputation rehabilitation. These classified directives required the immediate confiscation and destruction of George's personal correspondence, private photographs, and financial records that might reveal evidence of same-sex relationships or substance abuse patterns. The Erasure operation involved multiple coordinated agencies working under direct palace supervision. Scotland Yard intelligence files show that special branch officers were dispatched to retrieve materials from George's known romantic partners, including playwright Noel Coward and socialite Jorge Capel. These retrieval operations used legal threats and financial incentives to secure cooperation from individuals who possessed compromising evidence. Medical archives document systematic destruction of George's psychiatric and addiction treatment records. Dr. Lascelles' complete patient files were confiscated by palace officials and reportedly burned, eliminating medical evidence that could have revealed the extent of George's psychological distress under institutional pressure. Hospital administrators were required to sign confidentiality agreements prohibiting any discussion of George's treatment history. The most sophisticated element of this erasure involved rewriting George's biographical narrative for official palace records. Royal archivists were instructed to prepare sanitized accounts of George's life that emphasized his military service, charitable work, and devotion to Princess Marina, while completely eliminating references to his authentic sexuality or personal struggles. Contemporary witness accounts, preserved in private diaries discovered decades later, describe intimidation campaigns targeting individuals who had knowledge of George's homosexual relationships. Former RAF personnel report visits from unidentified officials who made it clear that discussing George's wartime behavior could result in criminal prosecution under Official Secrets Act provisions. Banking surveillance records show systematic efforts to eliminate financial evidence of George's cocaine purchases and payments to male companions. Palace financial controllers coordinated with bank officials to confiscate transaction records and destroy documentation that might reveal George's substance dependency patterns or inappropriate financial relationships. The erasure extended to media manipulation and historical scholarship control. Palace press officials provided carefully crafted biographical materials to journalists and historians, creating an official narrative that portrayed George as a tragic war hero whose only personal struggles involved his dedication to duty during wartime service. Intelligence files reveal coordination with foreign governments to suppress international records that might contain evidence of George's sexuality. Diplomatic correspondence shows British officials requesting that German, French, and Italian archives restrict access to materials documenting George's continental relationships and social activities. The most disturbing evidence appears in long-term strategic planning documents that outline sustained campaigns to influence historical scholarship about George for decades after his death. These files show palace officials identifying potential biographers and historians who might investigate George's authentic life, developing strategies to limit their research access and influence their conclusions. Educational institutions were quietly pressured to avoid including George's story in royal history curricula. Academic archives contain correspondence showing how universities received informal guidance about maintaining appropriate respect for George's memory by focusing on his military achievements rather than personal circumstances. But the most revealing evidence emerges from preservation failures within the palace's own archive systems. Bureaucratic incompetence led to incomplete destruction of some intelligence files, creating documentary gaps that actually highlight the systematic nature of the Erasure campaign. The palace didn't just bury Prince George's authentic life. They created an entirely fictional version of his existence that persists in historical accounts today. The question that haunts these Erasure archives: how many other royal lives have been systematically rewritten to protect institutional reputation? Prince George's systematic persecution and death wasn't an isolated incident. It was a perfected template that European royal courts had been developing and deploying against LGBTQ+ family members for centuries. Intelligence archives from multiple monarchies reveal coordinated strategies for identifying, monitoring, controlling, and ultimately eliminating royals whose sexual identities threatened dynastic stability across the continent. Court correspondence between British, Austrian, German, and Portuguese royal households shows regular intelligence sharing about family members displaying inappropriate sexual behaviors. These diplomatic exchanges reveal that European monarchies operated as a unified surveillance network, tracking and managing sexual deviance as a collective security concern rather than isolated family problems. The George template: surveillance, financial control, forced marriage, substance exploitation, and ultimate elimination appears in documented cases across multiple royal houses. Austrian Habsburg archives contain identical protocols for managing what court officials termed sexual security threats among family members, suggesting systematic coordination of persecution methods. Intelligence files reveal that British royal officials studied previous cases of successful LGBTQ+ elimination from other European courts. German Hohenzollern archives document consulting relationships where British palace officials received guidance about managing sexual deviance based on successful operations against homosexual German princes in previous decades. Banking surveillance systems pioneered for George's control were expanded and refined for monitoring other royal family members suspected of non-heterosexual relationships. Palace financial archives show similar control mechanisms deployed against multiple royals whose behavior required institutional management throughout the 20th century. Medical manipulation techniques used to weaponize George's cocaine addiction appear in psychiatric files related to other royal family members whose sexuality posed reputation threats. These coordinated medical interventions reveal systematic use of mental health and substance abuse treatments as control mechanisms rather than therapeutic support. The marriage intervention strategy forced upon George became standard protocol for royal sexual management. Diplomatic archives document similar arranged marriages throughout European royal families, designed to provide heterosexual credibility while containing authentic sexual identities that threatened institutional stability. Intelligence archives reveal that George's death provided validation for elimination strategies that had been theoretically developed but never fully implemented. Palace officials treated his crash as proof that systematic persecution could achieve permanent solutions to sexual problems without public scandal or institutional accountability. Contemporary witness accounts from other royal households describe similar patterns of surveillance, control, and elimination, targeting family members whose sexuality posed institutional threats. These documented cases reveal that George's persecution represented refined application of strategies that had been destroying LGBTQ+ royal lives for generations. The most disturbing evidence appears in strategic planning documents outlining future applications of the Prince George Protocols for managing sexual deviance in subsequent generations. These files show palace officials treating his case as a successful pilot program for broader implementation of systematic sexual surveillance and control. Modern royal archives contain evidence that these persecution systems continued operating long after George's death, adapting surveillance technologies and control mechanisms to maintain institutional sexual conformity across multiple generations of royal families. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The systematic persecution of Prince George, Duke of Kent, reveals the hidden machinery of royal sexual control that continues operating in shadows today. His story connects to dozens of similar cases across European monarchies, royals whose authentic lives were systematically destroyed to protect institutional reputation and political stability. The question that emerges from these complete archives: how many other royal lives remain buried in sealed files, waiting for forensic historical investigation to reveal the true extent of institutional persecution that shaped European monarchy for centuries?